The Horrible Tale of the Greedy Miner, a Boer fairy story. Once upon a time, there was a very greedy miner called Cecil. He had taken lots of other people's land in Africa, dug it so full of holes that it was like a very unpleasant Swiss cheese, and taken all the valuable gold and diamonds. He then got made Prime Minister of South Africa, but that wasn't enough. He still wanted more. When they discovered gold in the only bit of South Africa he hadn't mined, he knew he just had to get it. The people who lived there didn't want to give him their land, and so they said no. This made the greedy miner angry. He tried to take it, but failed, and because he'd made his grumpy queen feel embarrassed, he was sacked. But then other people realised that the greedy miner was right, and decided to come up with a new plan to take the land. The land was a set of states called the Boer Republics, and they were the home of farmers called the Boers. It was also home to a group of people who had more recently moved to the republics, who hoped to make a profit on their land. They were called Uitlanders. The grumpy Queen's own Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, had chosen a very strongly imperialistic man named Joe to be his colony secretary. Lucky that! He decided to send his mate Alf to South Africa to see what he could sort out. Eventually, Alf wrote to Joe telling him that the best plan was to go to war with the Boers and pretend it was because they were being unkind to the Uitlanders, and this went against the views of fair play. Sitting in his big expensive house, the greedy miner was rubbing his hands. The British at home were very enthusiastic and cheered loudly as they sent away their army. Well, some of their army, only about 14,000, but after all, they were only fighting a bunch of farmers who were fighting with garden implements. So that was probably too many anyway. So the war began with General Buller confident of victory. However, he was to be disappointed. While Buller liked to fight traditional set-piece battles, the Boers chose not to and used their better knowledge of the terrain to inflict terrible defeats on him. In December 1899, the Boers had 3 huge victories in Stormberg, Magersfontein and Colenso. The very popular newspapers called it Black Week, and the people who'd been very excited before started listening to a chap who was so indecisive he couldn't choose a first name, and had 3 of them. Well, actually, he wasn't that indecisive, and had said all along that the war was a bad idea. But this bad feeling didn't last for long, and when the news came back that a plucky young reporter come soldier, Winston Churchill, had made a brilliantly daring escape, outfoxing the foolish Boers, people fell back in love with the war. I have a copy here of the report about this brave escape that describes how fantastic Winston Churchill was. It's written by... oh, a W.S. Churchill. Then things got even better. They relieved Ladysmith, and with the introduction of Lord Roberts, and in particular the brilliant new General Kitchener, they began to turn the tide, taking town after town, and eventually managed to relieve the town of Mafeking, which Robert Baden-Powell had been in charge of, and had managed to keep the spirits of the people up with his nightly renditions of Ging Gang Gooly, which he later used as part of his recruitment drive for scouting for boys. No, I said boys. By the middle of 1900 the war was almost won, but the naughty Boers changed tactics and became guerrillas. That was perhaps too predictable, and headed into the depth of the veldt and mountains. This new tactic began to cause the British Army major problems, but this wasn't a concern for the new commander, Lord Kitchener, who decided to stop messing about with this fighting lark and change policy to scorched earth and concentration camps. Without crops and livestock to survive, and their families in prison camps, Kitchener rightly thought that the Boers would give up. But just to rub salt into the numerous open wounds, the internees were beaten, starved, and when they did get food it was sometimes spiked with glass or poisonous chemicals. When the very popular newspapers got word of this from an Englishwoman who had gone to see if she could help them, it was a scandal. Well, only in those papers that opposed the war, the others said she was a liar. In fact, when she tried to get back to South Africa in 1901, the British Army wouldn't let her in. Finally, the whole Liberal Party decided to give up on the idea that the war was any good and back David Lloyd-George's view that the Conservatives' view of social imperialism was a complete lie. The Conservatives believed, or told the people of England they believed, that by having an empire, the riches would trickle down and help everyone in society. The Boer War showed that this was painfully untrue, and when David Lloyd-George suggested a new idea that perhaps there should be a different style of system, The people of Britain voted for the Liberal Party in huge numbers, but the greedy miner didn't care that his old friends were all out of a job. He was too busy filling his pockets in the Boers' mines, and nobody lived happily ever after. Well, apart from the greedy miner.